Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the actual Constitution and, of course, the convention that it came out of. Now, that convention, which happened, or began, that is, in the month of May in the year 1787.
And this convention would last throughout the summer. Delegates would be sent initially from 7 different states and eventually from 12 different states. And these delegates are interesting because they were true delegates. They had the job to go to the convention and to change those Articles of Confederation, to find a way to get everyone to agree towards how they should be changed. Of course, if they didn't all show up, it shows you that problem immediately, and they didn't all show up. Eventually, though, these delegates realized that they were going to have to redraft the document and really create something entirely new. Now, the Constitution was the result of this, and it is a brilliant document. But what you have to understand is they really didn't have permission to do this. In fact, the delegates from North Carolina, when they returned home, they were arrested as traitors because they were seen as getting rid of the old government and establishing a new one, and they had no permission to do so in the first place. Another curious thing about the convention is that many of the creators of the Constitution are not very well-known names in American history. For example, men like John Adams, or Samuel Adams, or Thomas Jefferson, or Patrick Henry, or John Witherspoon were all absent at the convention. There were, of course, men like Madison and Hamilton and Washington and Franklin there, but still, some of the greatest leaders up until this time of American history were not there. Now, the entire convention was moderated by George Washington. That was one of the first orders of business, was to declare who should be in charge of it. And Washington, who was seen as a great unifier, someone who could bring people together, someone who had such presence that people listened to him, took his position up at the front of the room, sitting in a chair famous for the sun carved over it, the sun either rising or setting above the horizon, which, as some historians have noted, kind of showed how pivotal this convention was. Because many look back at this time and realize that had the states continued under the Articles of Confederation, probably the Confederation would have dissolved, whereas the Constitution really brought the states together. Now, whether or not that's true, it's hard to say. The war between the states shows that the dissolution would be there even after the Constitution. But all the same, this convention would be led primarily by another younger man by the name of James Madison, who was a great disciple and student and friend of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Madison, who was in his 30s at the time, was known for being a little bit scrawny, a little bit pale, and quite bookish. In fact, they said that he was a human encyclopedia. You could ask him information on any topic, from magnetism to surgery to farming to civics to economics, and he would give you a definition, even though he often had never practiced those arts himself. But all the same, he was respected, he was quite capable as a speaker, and he was quite knowledgeable and logical in all of his arguments, and so he really became the driving force, the wedge of the entire convention. Now, one of the primary problems that he had to face, and the entire convention had to face, was that there were all of these divisions. For example, the states were already divided. You had states that had large populations and states that had small populations. They were automatically at odds with each other. You had states that had northern cultures and states that had southern cultures. They were divided, especially over issues such as slavery. You had states that were largely earning their income off of trade and states that largely earned their income off of farming. They also had a natural divide. And so when the states came together and said, okay, what should this ideal form of government look like, several plans were proposed. For example, Virginia proposed a plan, which is known as the Virginia Plan, in which they argued that there should be 2 houses in Congress with 3 branches of government total, very much like what we have now. Only these 2 houses and most of the people in those branches of government should be directly elected by the people in such a way that the states with the most people have the most influence. Virginia argued for this because they were one of the greatest populated states at the time. Opposed to this were the people from New Jersey, And they came up with a plan known as, you can guess it, the New Jersey Plan, in which they argued there should only be one house in Congress with 3 branches, but in this house, it should have an equal number of representatives from all the states. That was because New Jersey had a much smaller population, and so they wanted something that would favor their small size. Eventually, a compromise was initiated, and that came from the state of Connecticut, which also was small, but they had the brilliant idea of proposing this. Now, the Connecticut plan also proposed that there be 2 houses, but the idea was this. There would be a House of Representatives, and those people would be elected, or the number of them would be determined by how many people were in each state. It would be determined on population. And that house would have the rule over any laws or any bills that involve the raising of money. Whereas there'd be a second house, that would be the Senate, and all the members of the Senate would be equal in terms of how many came from each state. There would always be 2. And the senators would be in charge of things like foreign affairs, of things like who was appointed, and so forth. Eventually, this Connecticut plan became the standard that was adopted. But they had other issues to solve. For example, they had to solve the whole issue of how to elect the executive, how to elect the president. Now, they had several things that they actually debated about this. One, for example, was, do you simply elect your president based upon the majority of people, what we call a direct democracy? And they feared that that would be a problem because if they did that, that direct democracy would put too much power in the hands of only the people. And if the people could be easily swayed by, say, the media, then they might elect a man who shouldn't be in office. Another idea was, well, let's just have the states elect the president. But if they did that, the states would often be at odds with each other and would be fighting, and the whole disunity issue would not be addressed. So then they said, well, what if the Congress elects the president? And the problem there was then the president might become a tool of the Congress. He would always be wanting to be on Congress's good side so that he could be president in the first place. And so what the Founding Fathers came up with is what we call the Electoral College, where the people of every state do go to vote for the president, but they're actually voting for electors who then actually choose the president. And so it was a way to protect our country and not just have it be a straight democracy or just have it be the states electing the president, but to use both of them in the process. As a result, the Constitution was a very unique document. In fact, the Constitution had an incredible checks and balance system, where out of the 3 branches of government, the executive branch of the president, or the legislative branch of the Congress, or the judicial branch of the Supreme Court, they each had very distinct powers, they each had very distinct duties, but no one had too much power, and they could all check each other. In fact, it takes the House of Representatives and the Senate and the Supreme Court to actually get rid of the president should he be accused and convicted of a crime. It's one of the brilliant ways that they design the Constitution so that there's all kinds of cross powers. There's all kinds of checks and balances. Another incredible thing they did with the Constitution was they made it so that it could be amended. They made a process built into it so that laws could actually be changed so long as so much of the House and the Senate and the states all agreed to it. You see, the Constitution is brilliantly designed upon those Old Testament models of prophet, priest, and king. Specifically, you have the role of prophet, who was to show what the law of the land was. That's our legislative branch. They determine the laws of our nation. You have the role of king in the Constitution. That's the whole role of the president. He actually enforces those laws. And you have the role of priest, who mediates between the law and the people. That's the Supreme Court. They make certain that the laws actually follow the rule and the spirit of the Constitution. Another brilliant aspect of the Constitution was that it mixed several different types of government. It's part democracy, because the people do directly elect their leaders. It's part republicanism, because the people elect representatives. It's part aristocracy, because you have people such as the senators, who were originally elected by the states and were tended to be more highly connected and of a wealthier background. You had the whole element of monarchy, because you have the president, who essentially is a king-like figure, even though he only rules for 4 years at a time. And of course, you have something like an oligarchy, which is a rule by several people because you have the Supreme Court, which is made up of a set number of justices. It happens to be 9 right now, but they can rule for as long as they want to or for as long as they live. That is why the Constitution is the oldest still in use Constitution in the world. It had a brilliant system, a brilliant setting of balances and checks of power. It made certain that no one man or one group of people had too much of it. It was a very just document.